Hello, and welcome to Quilt Moxie, the podcast, where Quilt Moxie meets Craftsy.com, an online community dedicated to providing the best education and resources for crafters. Join me, Ariana, your host, and come along on my video journey where I participate in the Craftsy online classes and community. Meet up with us online at quiltmoxie.com or at your favorite hangout, Craftsy, Ravelry, Facebook, Twitter. Check the credits at the end of the show for more. You can also subscribe to our mailing list to get your next and every episode with show notes delivered directly to your email as soon as the episode is available. It's as simple as dropping your email address and checking Receive Podcast by email. Welcome to episode 3, and today's topics include a little bit of housekeeping, Celtic Cables by Carol Feller, Entrelac by Gwen Bortner. Let's get started. So I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. Behind me, you're going to see my first modern quilting attempt. This quilt I exposed in our quilt exposition last weekend, and it is called There's a Turtle in My Window. I've decided to use my backdrop as a little mini gallery to showcase some of the other artistic endeavors that I pursue. And they include, of course, quilting. I love to quilt, and I'm a watercolorist as well. The next quilt that I'll be showing will be the quilt that I did with my husband, and we won a first place ribbon from the Canadian Quilter Association, so I'm very thrilled about that. And look for it in a future podcast. I'll see if I can put it somewhere in the back. It's quite large. The Celtic Cables by Carol Feller class, the carding is complete. The last time we left off and I had knitted the body, and I was still considering putting in a zipper as a closure, and I had a couple of little issues around the collar where there were little squares and things. So today I want to just bring you up to date on how I ended up finishing the cardigan. Now, as a newbie knitter, I am a newbie knitter, and I'm just amazed at the results that I was able to get by just taking an online class. Of course, it's not, I would say that the results are as a result of me taking the online class with a lot of help from the community and from Carol Feller. So had I been alone with a pattern, I don't know how successful I would have been, but it just gives you the confidence to go ahead and do something really special. So let's see. Let's talk about the buttons. So choosing buttons for my cardigan, what did I do? Here is my batch of buttons. I just gave this to my hubby, and I said, okay, can you find me some buttons? And basically the hardest part was to find 8 matching buttons to put on the cardigan. Well, these 8 buttons that I ended up putting on the cardigan were not matching. I think there were like 3 different, but they're pretty close. And I sewed them on with regular sewing thread, and I decided to give them the finishing touch by taking 1 ply of the actual wool and sewing that on top of the button, just so that it looks as if I used wool to sew the button, but I didn't. So the buttons are there securely, and I find that 1 ply of wool does give a nice finishing touch to the button. It's, in my opinion, very, very important, the finishing on anything that is going to end up going around your face, the button band, because these are, your eye is sort of drawn to the face of the person, and the small details on a button band, for example, I find make a big difference in the finishing. Somehow, if there's, anyway, I'm just saying that it's important. And as a result, I did take a look at the class by Anne Hansen, Button Bands and Buttonholes, which I watched thoroughly, and I'm thrilled that I can consult it at any time. She covers button bands on the bias. She goes through any permutation of a button band, including how to do the buttonholes, etc. I find that it's a really good reference class to have when you need it. I did end up following the instructions by Carol to install the button band. What I might have, the suggestion that I've read it many times, I heard Carol say it, I heard Anne Hansen say it when it comes to button bands, but I don't know what it is. But finally, when I did watch the button bands and buttonholes, I understood the importance that you block your cardigan before you apply the button band. And the other suggestion that I've heard or read many times is that before you assemble it, it's a good idea to block your pieces. Now that I've experienced picking up stitches on a blocked garment and the results that you get, which is the button band that I have here in the back, I would really encourage you to block before you apply a button band, or in my case, I'm going to be blocking before I'm picking up stitches on a collar or anything that's really of significance. So the collar is a very important area of a garment. The other thing I'm going to show you, I'm probably going to stop the taping for a minute so that I can turn the cardigan inside out to show you what I ended up doing with those corners that I had on my last video, and I showed you those little corners, and I did handle them in a peculiar way. As a result of the last podcast, there was a posting in Craftsy from a person who was having the same issues, or she thought she was having the same issues as I was with those little corners. And we both posted to Carol, who was kind enough to help us out again. And it turns out that, and I'm very happy to say this, that this particular knitter was a little bit wiser than I was, and she did knit or tink back to fix her collar, and her collar is now properly installed, or she had the reassurance from Carol that she was doing it right, and the results are good for her. So I'm happy that the podcast has helped somebody out. Okay, so the cardigan is now inside out on the mannequin, and you're going to see the facing that was created where I had cut open the steeks. So by cutting open the steeks here, you can see this, it makes a really nice facing along the inside of the button band, and I find it gives it a nice structure to the cardigan. So if you do want to steek your cardigan, I had a lot of success doing it by steeking. It also made my tension while I was knitting the cardigan a little bit more even, because I find that it's easier to keep an even tension when you're going in the round. And I just really like the facing that it created. And of course, anytime I get a chance to use a crochet hook on my knitting, I'm there. So when I did do the securing of the steeks, I used the crochet technique, and I find that it really gives a nice finishing touch to the button band area. The other thing about the button band is when I'm picking up stitches, what I like to do is I like to use a crochet hook. As you know, I love my crochet hook. To me, a crochet hook is like a knitting needle with training wheels. So my first purchase for really good quality needles was the Addi Turbo Click needles for knitting needles. I got that, and right away I got the Addi Click crochet needles. And I'm so glad that I splurged on the crochet needles, because when I'm picking up stitches for a button band, for example, I use the crochet hook. So here's what I've got set up, for example. This is the knitting needle on the interchangeable and the crochet hook. So what I do is I use the crochet hook to pick up my stitches, and then once I've got them all picked up, I can just switch over to the knitting needle. I just put a knitting needle back where the crochet hook was. I find picking up stitches with a crochet hook just a little bit easier. It's a personal preference. And when I did the pickup for the button band, for example, I did it in the same way that I do knitting socks or knitting my sleeves, which is 2 at the same time. So I picked up all the stitches along one side of the button band and along the other side with another ball of wool. So I had 2 balls of wool going at the same time. And that way I know that my button bands matched up perfectly. I don't know why, but I know button bands, I just had to have them perfect for some reason. And they were done at the same time. So I recommend doing it 2 at the same time. It really works for me. I like the results. And the crochet hook on the interchangeable for that is perfect. I love it. By the way, talking about knitting needles, now that I've become a little bit of a knitting snob, although still a newbie knitter, but a knitting snob, I really love the way the Addi Turbo knitting needles feel when the stitches come off of them. The other knitting needles that I love, 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 so if I could have my really perfect set of knitting needles based on what I already own, I have the ChiaoGoo interchangeable knitting needles, which are here, and I've got them here on my other project, with the red, I really love these wires, these red wires that the ChiaoGoo has. So if I was going to create my ideal set of knitting needles, it would be the pointiness and the connection smoothness of the ChiaoGoo with the red. But I like the way the connectors connect on the Addi Turbo. It's just that the ChiaoGoo is smoother. I've had a couple of incidences where it's somehow unscrewed while I was knitting on the ChiaoGoo. And I don't know if it's because the ChiaoGoo small knitting needles are pointier, or I have a choice to get them pointier, but the pointy needles are so much better, especially when you're doing cables. And I think Carol mentioned that, than the blunter tips of the Addi Turbo. And although they look identical, I'm not sure if it's my imagination, but the feel of the metal and the way the stitches feel when you're on the Addi Turbo metal, I like the feeling better on the Addi Turbos. So my ideal knitting needles are the cables, the red lace cables from the ChiaoGoo, the connection smoothness of the ChiaoGoo with the connector of the Addi lace, so it's very easy to connect and put it on, take it off. I like that, but it's not as smooth as the ChiaoGoo, and the pointiness of the ChiaoGoo and the feeling of the metal from the Addi. So those would be my perfect knitting needles so far. But maybe in a couple of months I'll change my mind. We don't know. Okay, so let's move along. So I've opened my steeks, I've put in my button bands, I've sewed on my buttons, and let's talk about those. And this I would have done first, of course, the collar, but I'm going to talk about the collar now. So in my last episode I had issues with those little corners. And what I ended up doing was I was doing a collar. This is where I deviated a bit from the pattern from Carol. I've decided to do a fold over collar, which I did in my original sweater. Let me see, I have it here. Just a minute, I'll show it to you. Okay, so my Crime Against Fair Isle sweater, I did a collar with a fold over facing to it. So on the right side, you see the collar has the ribbing here, and then there's one row of reverse stockinette, or it looks purled, and then you fold it over with a stockinette on the back. The trick to this is really, let's say you had 100 stitches for your collar, one row of reverse stockinette, and then it's 10% less stitches on the facing side, so 90 stitches on the facing, and that you would sew down so that your collar falls nicely. So this is what I did, very similar to this, with the exception of where I have the reverse stockinette on my Crime Against Fair Isle. I did a yarn over for the collar up here, and I find it gives it a really nice fold finish on this cardigan. So you can see up here that I still have my little corners sticking out, and I could have very easily hidden those little corners inside of my faced collar. But I decided not to, because when you wear it, it actually acts like a little bit of a shoulder pad. So those little corners, where they ended up on my collar, I find serve a dual purpose, so I kept them. So that's what I did with my little corners that shouldn't have been there in the first place. What did I learn from doing the Celtic cables? Well, now I understand that I can quilt and I can sew, and now I knit. And in those three hobbies or pursuits, I would say you have to be a real mathlete to do knitting. I would say you're more mathletic when you're knitting than when you're quilting or sewing. And I'm surprised to hear myself say that, because I would have thought, oh, quilting is way more complicated, there's more math involved. I don't think so. When it comes to getting a properly fit garment, there comes a certain part of the process, and it's not a big part, but it's a very important part, that you have to be plugged in. In my case, I had to plug in my spreadsheet and email Carol to help me out. But I am getting an appreciation about how much math is involved to get a properly fitted garment. So I'm a little bit hesitant to move on to a garment of my own that I would follow from a pattern. I'm going to be taking some other Craftsy classes before that. Hopefully in the next couple of classes I'll get my math feet, so to speak, so that I will be able to adjust any of the patterns in my future so that they fit properly when I knit them. And that's it. So I have a big appreciation for all the knitters out there on a math front. I'm very impressed. I'd like to thank Carol for all her help, and since you've seen me, newbie knitter, I promise you, newbie knitter, I was able to complete the cardigan, and I love it. I think it's just a wonderful garment, and it fits me beautifully. And not only does it fit me, it fits my mom, and Mom wants it now. So I'm very happy to say that the Irish wool that her friend brought her from Ireland is going to go home to Mom, and she will be delighted to be wearing this cardigan in the future. Let's continue with Entrelac by Gwen Bortner. Now, the first exposure I had to Entrelac was right after I learned how to knit my first pair of socks in Germany with Aunt Waltraud. and Uncle Klaus had purchased a book by Stephanie van der Linden, How to Knit Socks, which came with a DVD. And the book itself had a pair of entrelac socks in it. I thought that the DVD would have the patterns as well, and we had decided that I was going to take the DVD to Canada and she would keep the book in Germany just because of weight reasons and traveling with extra weight. Whatever the case is, I was very happy to take the DVD with me. But on the DVD, it did not have those entrelac socks. Needless to say, off to the library, and I had to look up entrelac just to see how to do it. And that was the first time that I had decided right away that I'm going to knit backwards, or knit like a knitting machine, or reverse knit, or mirror knit, however you say it. There's a lot of flipping your project back and forth because the rows are very short. So right away I said, I've got to just knit back. It was just driving me crazy flipping the work back and forth. So on my own, before I took the entrelac class with Gwen, I learned how to knit backwards, or knit like a knitting machine is what I call it, is where you go this way and then you knit back. This way and you knit back. But you do not turn your work, because I just felt that my wool was getting all tangled up. And it's the same thing that I do in socks as well. More than likely I started with the flap, the heel gusset in socks to knit backwards. In any case, I would have really appreciated the class by Gwen Bortner on entrelac. So let me show you our first project that we did. There are 3 projects in the class, and the first one was this cowl. And I'm going to include my first video ever, so you'll know just by default that I'm a total newbie knitter, because I called it Tinkabobble, and I just thought I liked the way it sounded. But tink is actually a negative term that I've learned here listening to podcasts, where you're always undoing what you've done. But I just thought it was knitting backwards, which it is, tink, but everybody understands it to mean unknitting. So I'm going to add that little video just so you can see my little Tinkabobble video, my first knitting video ever. So the modification to the project is, first of all, I used leftover wool. This was leftover wool from my mom's sweater that I had made her, and I dyed it using food dye. So she had 6 balls of white wool left from her sweater, and I dyed it using food dye, one in a variegated way, one in a greeny way, and one in a sort of a peachy way. And at every intersection I just added one of my little baubles just to change it up, and I finished the project with an I-cord trim. The project is a little bit looser than the regular one, but it's kind of cute. And what I really liked about this project was, although you have to be a mathlete being a knitting specialist, this project was so easy on the brains because you didn't have to worry about the final sizing, so I was very happy about that.
Welcome to QuiltMoxie.com. My name is Ariana, and today I'd like to show you how to tink a bobble. Let's get started. To tink a bobble, what I mean is another way to install a bobble. Instead of knitting and turning your work, you're going to be knitting backwards. So knit yourself to the place where you would like to install your bobble, and you'll be turning your 1 stitch into 5 by knitting in the front and back of the loop. So here's front and back, front, back, and one more loop in the front. Now you have your 5 stitches created out of 1. Instead of you turning your work right now, we're just going to tink instead of knit. Knitting backwards, which is basically English style, throwing your yarn to create a purl stitch without turning your work. To continue your bobble, you'll be doing 5 knit stitches here. First one I'm going to slip off. There are many ways to do a bobble. This is just one of the many. Once you have your 2 rows of bobble done on 5 stitches, you want to reduce to 3. We're going to do that by purling 2 together, but without turning our work. We're basically knitting backwards, 2 together, followed by 1 purl stitch, followed by 2 together, 2 purl stitches together, to complete our bobble, let's slip off the first stitch and knit the last 2 stitches together. Slip your slipped stitch over the last stitch to complete the bobble. And to secure it into place, knit the next stitch. Let's try it one more time. Knit to where you'd like to install a bobble. Increase your 1 stitch to 5 by knitting into the front and back of the loop. So here's where I will install the bobble. Knitting into the front, the back. Give yourself slack. The back, the front. You have 5 stitches on your needle. Now we're going to tink 5 stitches. So we're knitting backwards to create the purl stitches. This is practical when you have just a little bit of knitting and you don't want to turn your work. So you might be driving or sitting as a passenger, or you just have a little bit of knitting to do. Here we have it. To decrease, again, we're going to take our 5 stitches and reduce them to 3 by purling 2 together. Purl the next stitch. Purl the last 2 stitches of the bobble together. You have 3 stitches remaining. Slip the first stitch off. Knit the last 2 together, slip the stitch over the other stitch to complete your bobble. And to secure your bobble into place, we're going to knit the following stitch. And that is how we tink a bobble.
That was the first project. And Gwen does an excellent job teaching you how to knit backwards or knit like a knitting machine. In fact, her second project, this project was also, it's called Textured Scarf, and she shows you how to not only knit backwards, which is actually purling, but she shows you how to purl backwards, which is knitting. I don't know. I don't want to confuse anybody. I'm already confused saying it myself. But basically, you can knit and purl forwards and backwards. And Gwen has an awesome way of making sure that you can actually do that. So here's the second project that I did. This was not from my mom's stash. It was just some wool that I had lying around. And as you can see, I have no issues about running out of wool. So you can see here on the ending, I ran out of hot pink. And so I just filled it in with some green, and I have no problems with that. I still love the result. I love it because it's finished. And of course, I had to take my crochet hook to it, and I put a little crochet edging to it, just because I wanted to. So this project I really recommend for anybody who wants to learn how to knit and purl backwards, or going forwards, backwards, doesn't matter, without turning your work. So do this project if that is your goal. After you do this project, you can knit backwards, no problem, any project, and I use it everywhere. I'm knitting backwards all the time. The third project that Gwen covers is, now you've learned how to do entrelac in the round. You're doing entrelac knitting forwards and backwards. And her third project is a cape. And again, I love the project because although I do gauge swatch for the cape, let me see if I have my gauge swatch here somewhere. Here's my little gauge swatch for this project. This is from Mom's stash, some prehistoric wool, and I believe she's called Ingrid, 50 grams of Ingrid. And so I asked Mom to give me all her black wool. At a certain age, you really don't want to be knitting black. It's hard on the eyes, and I think there must have been a time period where all this textured wool was in vogue. So my mom has a lot of the textured wool, which I find more of a challenge to knit or crochet. In any case, here is the beginnings of the cape, and it is slightly off the, I've deviated from the pattern, but I'm following Gwen's instructions. I'm just consistent. So you'll see that the bottom part of the cape, where she has some lace here, is in red, and then I ran out of red. So that's where it changes. I believe I'm on tier 6, and I have a little bit more to go to finish up the cape. And what's special about this entrelac is that we are actually changing the size of the little entrelac squares, which means interlaced in French, by the way. So you can do shaping with entrelac. I really think this course is very, very well laid out. You have 3 basic projects which are easy to make you fit, or to fit almost anybody, and you learn so much doing these 3 projects. You learn how to go entrelac in the round, entrelac in the flat. You're doing it, you're knitting backwards and forwards, and you're also shaping your entrelac. So I really, really love this class. I would have loved to have taken it sooner. But live and learn. So I have a special surprise for everybody. My next podcast, I hope to have a surprise guest, and that guest is Gwen Bortner herself. I started the Ravelry group for our podcast, and lo and behold, she had offered to participate on our podcast. And I'm going to be opening up a thread on our Ravelry group, Quilt Moxie the podcast, where you can post any question that you would want to ask about Entrelac to the Entrelac Queen herself, Gwen Bortner, hoping, fingers crossed, that everything's going to fall into place, and our next podcast, she will answer, I don't know how many questions she'll have time to answer, but whatever you post, this is your chance to ask the Entrelac Queen herself any Entrelac question that you've always wanted to ask, and here is your chance. So take a moment, go to the Ravelry group, post your question in the thread, contact me in any way that you want. I'll be sure to get the question over to Gwen Bortner in time for her to answer it on our next podcast. So that's going to be so exciting. I can't wait. I like to combine crocheting somehow with my knitting. I really am convinced that a crochet hook is little more than a knitting needle on training wheels. I use it, and believe it or not, it's very easy to knit with a crochet hook. For those of you who have never considered using a crochet hook while you're knitting, I'll just give you an idea of when I use it. I use it for sure when I'm casting off stitches, picking up stitches, picking up dropped stitches, knitting. When I'm creating I-cord, I've even used it for the Kitchener stitch with a crochet hook. And I'm sure I'm going to come up with lots more techniques to use my crochet hook while I'm knitting. Now, one of the Craftsy classes that's coming up is Myra Wood's The Perfect Fit Seamless Lace, Crazy Lace Cardigan. I've been watching it. I haven't actually begun it, but I like to watch it before I actually do it. I have learned from Myra a wonderful, I really love this cast-on technique, which I tried on the Entrelac cape with a crochet hook. I love it. It is so cool. So watch for that in the future. And this holds true for quilting and sewing. I've noticed now that I'm knitting and listening to podcasts on knitting, etc., that there is something about picking up a needle and putting your thread in there to do a Kitchener stitch, sewing on a button, putting your pieces together, sewing them together, doing a gauge swatch, all of these kinds of activities that are less than exciting for a lot of us. In fact, even when I was thinking about putting the buttons on a cardigan, I was saying, oh, can I sew them on? I was ready to put them on my sewing machine just so I wouldn't have to put needle and thread together and sew on a button. Which makes me wonder if there isn't a way for us to come up with a way to make it fun. Now, when it comes to quilting, we have to, for example, to finish a quilt, we're going to be appliquing the back of the binding to finish your quilt and to put on a label. There are so many quilters, and I'm sure me too. I'm sorry. There are quilts that I haven't put on a label just because, first of all, I didn't want to create it, and then I didn't want to sew it on, etc. So what is it that's going to motivate us or give us the mojo to do the stuff that we really don't like to do? Now, I think I'm going to start a thread on our podcast group, Quilt Moxie the podcast, just to sort of canvas everybody and see what it is that you don't like to do when it comes to knitting. What's your least favorite activity? And I know somebody out there is going to chime in and say, oh my God, I really love doing it, or I used to not like it, but now I do, and this is why. So now, coming back to the binding, when we're doing a quilt and we've sewn on the binding and we have to turn it and we have to applique down, we actually love doing that. Why is that? Because once you have appliqued down your binding, your quilt is, for all intents and purposes, complete. So that is the motivation that gets our needle and thread out. In fact, it's kind of exciting when you get to the part where you're actually appliquing down your binding. So that's the kind of advice that I'd like to see happen in our group, to encourage everybody to take out their needle and thread, to want to sew down a collar or stitch together your piece, blocking, to block your pieces, to gauge swatch. And talking about gauge swatching, I had mentioned Myra Wood's class, the Perfect Fit Seamless Crazy Lace Cardigan class. Well, I was watching her doing her swatches, and those swatches, they look very, very cool. In fact, I'm kind of looking forward to doing the swatching part of her class. I don't know, maybe you'd like to put a comment on that in our group as well. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and please don't miss the next one, where we're going to have our Entrelac Queen Superstar join us and hopefully answer those questions that you've always wanted to ask about Entrelac. Take care. Bye for now. À la prochaine.